And hello, everyone, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible, right here on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm from Ardmore, Oklahoma, and over there is William Bell from Memphis, Tennessee, and All Things Fulfilled. William, good to see you again as usual.
All right, it's good to be here, and had to do one of those quick change costume changes, like they do when they're working between scenes
Oh,
on
yeah.
live.
Now, I was going to tell you, and you're getting ready to go back to Ghana.
No,
Um,
Burkina Faso.
who?
Burkina Faso.
Never heard of that. I'm
It's north of Ghana.
north of Ghana. Okay, very good. Well, now my question is, are you going to be with your shirt tailor?
I will be with the shirt tailor. And so if you want a shirt made, it'll be a Burkina Faso shirt. But theirs are cool too.
Okay,
This one is actually from Togo.
okay. I don't know any
So
what that means.
Togo is next door to Ghana.
Okay,
It's on the west side.
okay. Well, my shirt size is medium, US medium.
I don't know whether they measure them that way. You need to send me your neck size, your length from your neck down to your sleeves, and your chest size, and then they'll
Okay,
make it.
okay. I'll have to get my wife to. She would know how to measure all of that.
Okay.
I'll try to get that done. But I would like to order two shirts. Be glad to pay you for them when you get back. If I can get all that information and hopefully it's and I'll rely on your good taste.
Okay. All
Okay.
right.
All right. And boy, that sounds
I was about to say, did you have any color preference?
no. I like red. I like blue. I even like black. And
Okay.
all mixtures thereof.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay. We'll find you something.
All right. Well, anyway, folks, William will not be with us next week. Larry Siegel, Lord willing, will be able to be with us. I sent him a text today inviting him. And then the following week, I will not be on the program. My wife and I are going to take just a day or two off, a little bit of a vacation to get away and what have you. So anyway, uh, wish you Godspeed, William. Hope everything goes well. Understand Leora is going with you, and I hope there's not a bat in your hotel room.
If it is, I'm sure she won't be in there.
Yeah.
No, I
Okay.
think this will be cool this time.
All right. Now, is this a business, a government business? I'm not trying to
No,
pry.
no, 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 no. This is
Ministry?
it's oh, I can't think. I'm rushing, so I can't. My mind isn't functioning. But it's um, like charity stuff,
Oh, okay.
humanitarian efforts. Yeah.
Humanitarian. Very good. Well, I know that you gave a speech over there just recently on humanitarian work and integration with the gospel and what have you. So, okay, that sounds wonderful. Really does. Okay, folks, we are continuing our study of the Abrahamic promises, the Abrahamic covenant, the Abrahamic inheritance as it relates to eschatology, and more specifically, as it is developed in the book of Galatians. And we talked last week about how in Galatians chapter 4, and of course, the discussion actually begins in chapter 3, we talked about how unfortunate so many chapter divisions really are. But we talked about how in Galatians chapter 4, people use this as a way of saying that the law had already passed away when Paul wrote. And yet, interestingly enough, Paul uses the subjunctive mood. Paul uses terminology that indicates the inheritance had not yet been given. And William, just today, I was reading, there's this guy that, boy, he's been after me on Facebook and what have you. He is an acolyte of Ed Stevens. And he was talking about how the law absolutely positively ended at the cross. Strangely enough, William, and folks, this is directly related to the time of the inheritance of the Abrahamic covenant, because the Abrahamic covenant blessing, the inheritance, would be given at the end of the law of Moses. Paul makes that abundantly clear in Galatians chapter 3, 16 through 21. Okay, so this gentleman, amazingly enough, William, said Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 is positive proof that the law ended at the cross. Would you like to comment on that just a little?
He said that Paul positively stated that the law ended at the cross.
No, he says Matthew 7, 5, 17 and 18.
17.
Definitively, and as absolute, actually, his word was, this text explicitly teaches that the law ended at the cross.
Oh, that's going to be a huge, huge problem.
Yeah.
First of all, Jesus said that he did not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill it. And so the message there is he came to fulfill the law and the prophets. And he said, till heaven and earth pass, one jot or one tittle would in no wise pass from the law, till all were fulfilled. So that covers the law and the prophets, meaning that all prophecy had to be fulfilled before the law passed away. And that's the message of Christ. That's the message of his apostles in the epistles, even in the book of Revelation. It's the same all the way through. And so unless he's going to, opt for positing the passing of heaven and earth at the cross, then he's got a real serious problem. In addition to that, when Jesus spoke about the fulfillment of the things that he had said during his ministry, as he remarked on it in Luke chapter 24, 44 through 47, he gathered the disciples together and said, these are the things which I spoke with you during the time when I was with you. And he says that thus it behooved Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and that repentance and remission of sin should be preached in his name among all nations, beginning at Jerusalem. And he said these things had to be fulfilled in the law, the Psalms, the prophets. And so he was covering all of that, or using all of that to refer to, that old covenant and the things that had to be fulfilled in Moses' law, etc. But he said that included his suffering, which would have been on the cross. And of course, that's the John 19:30 passage. But also it included his resurrection, which didn't happen at the cross. So he's got a problem there. And then he tells the disciples to wait. And we know that there was, a 40 to 50-day period between that time frame when he tells them to wait until they are endued with power from on high before they began preaching according to the Spirit that was also prophesied in the old covenant. So he's got a real serious problem. And the gospel had to go to all the nations, to the Jew first, and then to the Greek, to the Gentiles. So unless all of that happened at the cross, we've got a real serious problem with the law being fulfilled at that time. And it certainly doesn't fulfill the feast days. And I think this is the same guy that's been hassling you over the feast days, is it not?
Okay, one of them.
Oh, yeah, I get it.
Yeah. In fact, after being at the office early this morning and doing a lot of correspondence on both YouTube and Facebook, and I was just getting, assaulted from all sides. And when I went back over to the house, I told Jan, I said, wow, this must be designated as let's all dog pile on Von Preston Day. Because I was just catching it from all sides. And she said, well, why don't you just take a break and just don't even answer them? I said, well, the trouble of it is they're so easy to answer. These guys destroy their own claims. So I said, all it does, it just takes me a little while to expose what they've given me. It's not a great challenge. And I said, that's not a brag. It's just simply the way it is. I said, they get on there and they attack me as a heretic and a false teacher. And blah, 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 blah. And they make all of these outlandish claims that all you have to do is use their own words against them.
Yeah.
And so when I read this gentleman's, when I read this gentleman say that Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 explicitly says that the law had to pass at the cross, I'm going, well, number one, explicitly demands the statement the law passed at the cross. That's what explicitly would demand. Secondly, the word and the terminology of the cross is not in Matthew 5, 17 and 18. But thirdly, as you were pointing out there, if he's going to appeal to Matthew 5, 17 and 18, and William, you and I have done this year after year after year after year, and we have pointed out that those who say the law passed at the cross, and they even go to Galatians chapter 4, look, even a child, as long as he's in the house before the time appointed, he is no better than a slave, even though he is master of all. But when the time appointed comes, he is master, he receives the inheritance. And here is Paul saying we were under the law until the Christ should come. Of course, they misunderstand the terminology until the faith, until the coming of Christ. That's a reference to the second coming. It's not a reference to Jesus's incarnation. But nonetheless, those who make that appeal absolutely ignore Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. It's like they're cherry picking, and they actually ignore what Matthew 5, 17 and 18 genuinely says. We'll say more about that momentarily. But Matthew 5, 19, William, completely and totally blows them out of the water.
Oh, yeah.
So here is Jesus saying, I didn't come to destroy, but to fulfill. Verily I say unto you, until heaven and earth passes, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law until, and of course, that terminology of all fulfilled, we'll talk more about that. And then Jesus says, whosoever shall teach, what in the world? I downloaded a program today that was supposed to be helpful to me, and all it's doing is giving me pop-ups. I'm really, really not happy with that. Even though I was told it would help me to find a way to create indices for my books. Well, anyway. So anyway, Jesus said, whosoever shall teach anyone to break the least of these commandments, that's in the law and the prophets, shall be called least in the kingdom. Whosoever doesn't, in other words, the reverse of that is that in the kingdom, the law would be taught. Let me turn over there for some reason.
Whosoever should break one of these least commandments.
Exactly. I don't know why I'm having a brain burp on that, but let me just read the text verbatim. Okay, there we are. Matthew chapter 5, verse 19. Whosoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments. Well, what commandments would he be talking about, ladies and gentlemen? That's the commandments of the law found in the law and the prophets. That teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. Well, what's the kingdom of heaven? Was Jesus referring strictly to the old covenant kingdom here? Or was he referring to the new covenant kingdom during the interim period? That's the real question. But whosoever does and teaches them, he shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now, when we follow that terminology of great in the kingdom, or that terminology in the kingdom, in the New Testament, that's reference to the establishment of the church, as I understand it. Is that your understanding?
Yes.
So here is Jesus saying, whosoever breaks one of the least of these commandments shall be called least in the kingdom. Oh, wait a minute. The kingdom wasn't established, or so the story goes, until the day of Pentecost, 50 days after the cross. So here's Jesus saying, those who break the least of the commandments in the kingdom will be called least in the kingdom, but the kingdom doesn't exist until after the law is done away with, is the argument. And that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. How can you teach someone to keep the whole law in the kingdom, which is established after the law is abrogated? It's just,
Yeah, they would be teaching an abrogated law based on that. And you know what's interesting, you can see how the apostles and the rest of the brethren in the church did exactly what Jesus said, particularly the Jews, because as Paul said, he taught no other things than those which are written in the law and in the prophets. Peter said the same thing in 1 Peter 1:10 through 12, and John in Revelation 10:7, and other passages. So they were all going back to the law, James as well. And of course, Acts chapter 21 is very clear in terms of, the charge they made against Paul, saying, you're teaching things contrary to the law and you're telling them not to circumcise their children. It's look, we need to get this straight. You come and demonstrate and show to all of them that you yourself also walks orderly and keeps the law. And Paul did that. So the argument that the law ended at the cross and that it was just totally defunct at that point just doesn't work.
I was literally astounded as I read this fellow's rather lengthy post, and it can be found on the internet, of course, on Facebook. And if anyone wants a link, I'll be glad to provide it. I'll be writing a response to it. But nonetheless, so here is Jesus saying that not one jot or one tittle should pass from the law or the prophets. Now, that's an elliptical statement. Do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy the law or the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. Okay. And again, that's elliptical. That's just simply understood. That's the mechanics of language, is what that is. Okay. So, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law or the prophets until all is fulfilled. And yet, here is a guy and all of those who follow him saying that the law passed away before all of the law was fulfilled, because the law contains the feast days. But the feast days weren't fulfilled at the cross. Some of them were. Passover was, but the rest of them wasn't. Feast of Unleavened Bread wasn't. Pentecost wasn't. And so here's a guy who's saying the law in its entirety, that's what he said, passed away at the cross. And Matthew 5:17 and 18 explicitly says this. I guess, William, this is a classic example of what they call eisegesis, reading something into the text that absolutely, positively is not there. And it's amazing how preconceived ideas have that power over us to cause us to have verses to say what they absolutely do not say.
It's true. And to just blindly continue to follow those things when the text says that they've been done away, and then or when they're saying that the text has been done away, but yet that same law with some of them, I know it's not all of them, but with some of them, they're advocating for the future fulfillment of things. Maybe not the guys that you're talking about.
No, not this man. No.
Yeah, so he's a preterist, I would take it, but others, would even view prophecy yet to be fulfilled. I mean, it's the same logic from that perspective.
Yeah.
And yet they're saying the law was fulfilled at the cross, but the prophecies that relate to the end time were not. Only this guy is, he's a preterist, so he's arguing that, everything happened at that point. But if that's the case, then what's he going to do with the rapture and all of those things that's supposed to have occurred in 70 AD? I mean,
that's exactly where I was going. How can you affirm that the second coming, the judgment, the resurrection, and the fulfillment of the feast days didn't happen until AD 66, and yet affirmed that the law, which foretold the coming of the Lord, judgment, resurrection, kingdom, salvation, the old law predicted those things. And yet you got them all fulfilled at the cross, and yet not fulfilled until 66 AD. That's double talk. That's just absolutely double talk. So, and by the way, I just have to throw this out there. Here is Jesus in Luke 21, verse 22. Now, remember, folks, Jesus said, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law or the prophets until it's all fulfilled. Now, William, you know as well as I do, most people, I say most, an awful lot of people like to say, well, it doesn't say the law and the prophets, Don, but that gets back to what we were saying a moment ago. When Jesus said, I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, I did not come to destroy. Well, elliptically, in the world of grammar, in the world of literature, that's an ellipsis. An ellipsis is a shortened way to say, sometimes by repetition, but to say in a shortened way what's already been said so as to reduce redundancy. So here's Jesus saying, don't think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, but to fulfill the law and the prophets. Until heaven and earth passes, not one jot or one tittle shall pass from the law or the prophets until it is all law and the prophets is fulfilled. Now, I do not see, William, and of course, I say that I do not see, but growing up, I argued from Matthew chapter 5, 17 and 18 that the law passed away at the cross. Because I would go over to Luke chapter 18, 30 and 31, that Jesus fulfilled all things written concerning him, concerning his suffering, burial, and resurrection. So I said, see, he fulfilled all things. I didn't see the qualifier there. So
Tell you what, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say what used to get me, I didn't grow up studying these things. I learned them after I was about 20, 21 years old. But I was engaged with a lot of, different denominational views, interacting with them. And one time I went to the Seventh-day Adventist meeting.
Oh, yeah.
And and the guy got up and challenged everybody in the audience about Matthew 5, 17 and 18. He said, till heaven and earth pass. He said, well, look up, look down under your feet. He said, where do you think you are? And the law has not been fulfilled. Of course, they still make that argument today.
Yeah, they do.
But it just shows that they didn't understand what heaven and earth was in that particular passage. But at that point, I didn't have a clue about eschatology either.
Yeah. Well, I had similar experience, if you please. When I was 17, my father was training me to be a salesman in our family egg business. One of my stops was in Pea Ridge, Arkansas. There is a huge Adventist community there, and had a store there. I sold eggs to them. One of the leading elders from that community ran the store. He owned the store, and he was a wonderful, wonderful man. Very humble, very kind. 2 times a week, he and I would go at it. I'm telling you. And Matthew 5, 17 and 18, that was part of our argument. And he did basically like the fellow that you're talking about at that Seventh-day Adventist church. And he said, look around. And he used to call me young fella, and he did so respectfully. He was not in any shape, form, or fashion disrespectful. And he said, look around, young fella. Heaven and earth. Well, I couldn't see what he was saying. I got it, but I didn't know how to handle it. So I said, no, you're making the wrong application. Jesus said, until it's all fulfilled. When was all fulfilled? Okay. Yeah, Luke 24, Luke 18, blah, blah, blah. We would just come butt heads. Neither one of us were right. Neither one of us was right. And one day, I don't even know what I said, but it got the better of him. And he actually got a little bit frustrated, and he ran me out of the store. I didn't know if I was going to lose him as a customer or not, but I went back the next week. And he was very humble, very apologetic. He said, I was completely out of line. I want to apologize to you. I enjoy our discussions together. all this kind of stuff. But we still, neither one caught the power of that text. Because I did ask him, and this may have been, I don't remember, but this may have been at the point at which he got angry. But I often ask people when they throw that argument up, well, look, heaven and earth is still here. I said, well, let me ask you, do you still practice physical circumcision as a mandate from God? Well, no. Then part of the law has passed. Do you travel to Jerusalem 3 times a year as a command of God? Well, no. Well, then part of the law has passed. And you just go down the list and you can say, well, you're clean shaven. You've shaved your beard. Part of the law has passed, therefore. And you can just go down the list of things that none of the Adventists would say are binding today. Therefore, they believe that part of the law has indeed passed away. Well, if any part of it has passed away, then obviously heaven and earth has passed away. Okay. William, are you with us? Are you okay?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm a little tired, but I'm good.
All right. So anyway, this is a really, really critical issue, ladies and gentlemen, of when the law of Moses passed away. One final point on this, William. This gentleman claimed in writing that the key argument of those, and he named you and me, of those who say that the law did not pass until it was, all fulfilled in AD 70, is Hebrews chapter 9. The Holy Spirit indicating this, that the way into the holiest of all is not yet made manifest, while that most holy place, or while that cultus, still has standing. Well, he says, these preterists, although some of them may be honest, but they're ignorant of the true meaning of this text. Because they claim that the law would not pass until the temple itself was no longer standing. Well, if you don't know any Greek whatsoever, if you don't do any comparative study and if you don't do any lexical studies, if you don't do any translational comparisons, I have known a couple of preterists in the past who made that argument. I tried to correct it, and they took the correction. But William, it doesn't say there was no entrance into the holy place while the first tabernacle is standing, does it?
No. It's one of the things you would have to think about would be when the temple was destroyed back during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And so it wasn't standing then, but that wasn't the end of the law. The actual text says, while the first tabernacle has a standing, which is a covenantal standing. So as long as the covenant was there, the authority for the tabernacle stood. And that's the argument that really should be made, as opposed to saying the physical structure was there. Because the authority for the temple as a covenant structure was still inherent in the in the scriptures, in the authorized by the scriptures. And so if it were torn down, there was still authorization to at some point to rebuild it. And so that's what's missing from their argument.
And that's confirmed by the fact that Hebrews chapter 9 verse 10 says that Old Testament cultus, which stood only in meats and drinks, divers washings, carnal ordinances, imposed until the time of the Reformation. That word imposed is from the Greek word epikaimai, a form of it there, and it literally means legally imposed. So there could be no entrance into the most holy place, i.e. heaven itself, while the law was still being imposed. Now, William, you and I were raised in an environment, in a theological environment that said no man can go to heaven until the end of time. Why? Well, because Christ hasn't come. The judgment hasn't come. But according to Hebrews chapter 9, the only thing to keep us out of the most holy place was sin and the lack of forgiveness, because the old law could not forgive. Therefore, if we do not get to go to heaven when we die, what does that mean? It means the law of Moses would still be in effect. Is that valid?
Yeah, it's valid. That just ties right into what we've been talking about on Galatians
Exactly.
and the inheritance.
The Abrahamic promise of the new heaven and the new earth, the world of everlasting righteousness, would not be obtainable until the end of the law of Moses. That's essentially what this is saying. So that's a great way to segue right back to Ephesians chapter 4. Now, in Ephesians, any other concluding thoughts there on this idea that the law passed away at the cross?
No, I think that's covered pretty well in terms of looking at it from Hebrews. You have the text in Hebrews 7, 11, and 12 that says, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, what need would there be for another priesthood? I need to look over there because now I'm having an issue in terms of trying to remember the text. But he says, therefore, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, what further need was there that another priest should rise according to the order of Melchizedek and not be called according to the order of Aaron? But the language in the next verse for the priesthood being changed, that's like present or a passive action that's going on at the time, indicating that the priesthood was in the process of being changed. Why would there be a priesthood existing if the law had already passed? That would be the end of the old Levitical priesthood and everything. But he says, for the priesthood being changed, of necessity, there is also a change of the law. And if you read through, like verse 18, he will mention again, for on the one hand, there is an annulling of the former commandment because of the weakness and unprofitableness thereof. And so, and the bringing in of a better hope. So all of those passages, looking at the verb tenses, etc., indicate that these things were in a process of being disannulled while the new covenant was coming in, being established.
And then he kind of consummates there in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13,
Yes.
in that he says, a new covenant, he's made the first old, and that which is growing old is ready to vanish away, is being made obsolete, or is made obsolete, and is nigh unto vanishing away. By the way, this fellow in the article that I was mentioning earlier in the program, he said, well, when he says that which is old is growing, that which is growing old is becoming obsolete and is nigh unto passing, he says that's not a reference to the law, it's just a reference to the cultic practices, the sacrifices themselves. Well, in Hebrews chapter 8, verses 6 through 13, and into chapter 9, the word covenant is used at least 5 or 6 times as the focus of his discussion, not the external observations of the covenant, but the covenant itself. It was a better covenant that was coming. It was the old covenant that was growing old. And so the focus is not on the external ceremonies. As a matter of fact, he even goes so far as to say in Hebrews chapter 9, that first covenant had practices. Okay, so his focus is on the covenant. And to be sure, the practices of it, but the practices were not the ultimate focus. It was the covenant that gave those practices any kind of validity whatsoever, as limited as that was. So there is a rule, as I understand it. Certainly, some scholars have pointed this out, scholars such as David Powell in his book on Acts and the second Exodus. David Powell says, in the Greek, the number of times that a subject is mentioned in a text indicates how important it is. So in the context and the text of Hebrews chapter 8, 6, all the way into chapter 9, I think it's down to verse 3 or 4, you have this word, the word itself, covenant, is mentioned just boom, 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 boom. And the practices of the covenant are barely mentioned. So that means and it reinforces what I was just saying, the focus is on the covenant. the covenant growing old, the covenant passing away, a new covenant that was in the process of being delivered. So all of this reinforces what we're trying to say, folks. The idea was, number one, the Abrahamic covenant inheritance would be given at the end of the law of Moses. But the law of Moses was still in effect. And William, we just got to cover this. We can't let this go. An objection is often made. This fellow makes it in his article. Well, if what Preston and Bell are saying, then that means that there were two covenants in effect at the same time. And then of course he makes an incredibly erroneous statement that would mean that the Christians were fully under full obligation to go to Jerusalem and offer the sacrifices. Now, we know that Paul observed the law, as you've already pointed out. That's extremely troublesome for whoever studies the passing of the law. It's not an easy subject. That doesn't mean that Paul was in error, as this gentleman claimed, by the way. He said Paul was in error. And Peter, by the way, might have also been in error himself. So here's a guy, because of his preconceived idea about the time of the passing of the law and what it meant, that is willing to say that both Peter and Paul were wrong. That's amazing. Truly amazing to me.
They'd have to make James wrong too, because James is the one that called Paul out.
Yeah, exactly.
On what the people were thinking.
Yeah, and the entire church leadership at Jerusalem, not just James, it's the entire prophetic body of the church at Jerusalem. They're the ones standing behind James, telling him, you got to straighten Brother Paul out on this now. So that's quite a charge that I find deeply, deeply troubling. But again, it springs from that presuppositional idea that the law had to have passed at the cross. But what about the idea, William, of two laws existing side by side?
Well, that's very obvious from the scripture that you did have two laws existing side by side. You just read from Hebrews 8 and verse 13, where it says that the old law was becoming obsolete and that it was at hand to vanishing. But the new covenant had already also been implemented as well, and so it had its beginning during the time. However, the issue is that as they died with Christ in baptism, that released them from the condemnation of the law, so that they could continue serving God in the newness of the new covenant, and not be condemned under the law. That's what Romans 8 says. Therefore, to those who are in Christ Jesus, they have no condemnation. The condemnation came under the law, but because they had been freed from the law through dying with Christ, they were not under the condemnation of the law. But that didn't mean that the law had been fulfilled.
I like to illustrate it like this. Now, this has been some years ago, obviously. It's been almost 40 years now, or 35 years. But in 1990, just prior to 1990, I'll go back a few years, there was, standing between East Berlin and West Berlin, there was a wall. There was barbed wire. There were soldiers. If you tried to cross from East Berlin to West Berlin, you would be shot. You'd be hauled off to prison and never seen again. And what we find is that countless numbers of people escaped East Berlin, managed to go under, managed to go over, managed to go through, whatever, but they managed to escape East Berlin. And so I ask people, point number one, were there two laws in existence at the same time, living side by side? Well, obviously there were. West Berlin, East Berlin. Okay. So when someone from East Berlin managed somehow, some way to escape from East Berlin, does that mean that the law of East Berlin, does that mean that communism died the day they escaped East Berlin? No, it means they died to the law of East Berlin. They died to the law. And isn't that what Paul says in Romans chapter 7, William? You
Yes.
have become dead to the law through the body of Christ, just exactly as you were saying there a moment ago. They had become dead to the law by being buried with Christ, joined with his death in baptism, by which, coming under the power of his death, they had died to the law. Doesn't mean the law died. Now, I didn't see that for a long time. In my very first book, the one on 2 Peter chapter 3, I actually wrote in there, Romans 7 is very clear that the law died on the cross. Well, okay. I learned differently. So when I wrote the elements shall melt with fervent heat, I just pointed it out. I said, here's what I used to teach. Here's what I wrote. Here's what the text actually says. I was wrong. So again, you have two laws in existence at the same time. You have two different groups of people under each respective law. But to escape from East Berlin to West Berlin was to die to the law of East Berlin. But then in 1990, the law of East Berlin came crashing down. That's when the law of East Berlin ended. Well, in the New Testament, during this transitional period of time, you have believers dying to the law by entering Christ through baptism. But they were still looking for the end of the law through the fulfillment of the law, which meant tragically, catastrophically, Jerusalem and the temple and the priesthood and the genealogies had to be destroyed to fulfill the law. Is that not incredibly ironic, William? That for the new to come, the old had to be destroyed.
Yes. Have to be removed.
So, this objection that seems to carry some kind of weight with an awful lot of people by saying, well, what you're saying is there were two laws in effect. Well, yeah, that's right. There were. There are two laws in effect for now. We're under the gospel. We're under the gospel of Jesus Christ. Those who are outside of Christ are not under the gospel. They're under the law of the world. Or am I completely mistaken on that?
I mean, just parallel to Romans 6, because Paul said that they died to sin. He says, how shall we live any longer in it? He didn't say that sin died at that point, but he said they died to sin through being baptized into Christ. And so that's the same argument that he makes in Romans 7. They're really parallel arguments, just made, regarding two different subjects.
Right. Okay. So let's shift gears here on the little bit of time that we have left. Let's go back to Galatians chapter 4. We'll begin reading with verse 3 and we'll go down through verse 7. Even so, when we were children, were in bondage under the elements of the world. But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive the adoption as sons. And because you were sons, God sent forth the Spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father. Therefore you are no longer a slave, but a son. And if a son, then you are an heir of God. Well, he's already just said, if any man be in Christ, he has put on Christ, where there is neither Jew nor Greek, bond nor free, male or female. And if you're Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Well, now he's reiterating that you are a son and you are heirs. Now, William, this whole concept, this entire concept found here in Galatians chapter 4 is one of adoption. Correlate that for us, integrate that for us with the promise of the Abrahamic inheritance.
All right. Well, when you speak about the Abrahamic inheritance, as we've discussed, throughout this study, that was the promise of resurrection. It was the promise of life. And when he talked about the adoption in Romans 9:4, Ephesians 1:4, and here in Galatians 4 and Romans 8, he's speaking of it in terms of the time of the inheritance, the time of the fulfilling of the promise. In Romans 8:23 particularly, he speaks about the adoption as the redemption of the body. And, many would reason that he's talking about the physical body, but that's not the physical body. That's the body of Christ being redeemed. It's tied to the first fruits of the Spirit, just as Ephesians 1:13 and 14 ties in the inheritance with the first fruits of the Spirit. And so the adoption in Romans 8 and verse 23 would be equivalent to the promise of Abraham, which is life, the inheritance that has been spoken of throughout the study.
Yeah, Peter ties it in 1 Peter chapter 1. He says that God has begotten us to an inheritance which is incorruptible, undefiled, which does not fade away. Every commentator that I'm aware of understands that's resurrection life.
Mm-hmm.
Now they want to make that incorruptible physical bodies, unfortunately, but that's not, of course, that's not what the text says. But it is everlasting life. It's eternal life in the presence of God. Now, let's go back here to Romans chapter 8. And one of the things, and you barely touched on the hem of the garment there, William, that I think we have to demonstrate. And this is such a thorn in the side of both the amillennial and the postmillennial world. Certainly in the amillennial world in which you and I, had our affiliation. But in that view, God was through with Israel at the cross. All promises under the old covenant were fulfilled by the time of the cross. On Pentecost, God started all over again with the church, the body of Christ. Nothing after Pentecost is in fulfillment of God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel. And William, you remember at Marlow, Oklahoma, when I asked Bill Lockwood if his eschatological hope was based upon and taken from God's old covenant promises made to old covenant Israel found in the Old Testament, he just categorically said, N-O, underlined 3 times, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point, and on and on. And yet, when I got up and read some of the scriptures, the very scriptures that you cited there, that Paul's hope of the resurrection was nothing but the hope of Israel, found in Moses, the law, and the prophets, Bill said not one single thing in response to that reality. Because he had no answer, because in the churches of Christ, there is no answer for this. That's all there is to it. So when we understand this whole idea of adoption, how Paul in Galatians 4 ties the adoption to the Abrahamic promise. So what is the nature of the inheritance? What is the nature of the adoption? It's everlasting life. It's righteousness. It's sonship. So in Romans chapter 8, I thought we'd just kind of jump in here. Paul is discussing life of the flesh, life of the spirit. Now, Paul doesn't talk about flesh and spirit, maybe in the way that we would think in our modern way of terminology. One of the guys I'm talking about that I'm discoursing with on Facebook, to him, a quote, simple reading of a text demands a literal fulfillment. And as I pointed out, well, that's the problem. You're not thinking in Hebraic concepts. You're misusing Hebraic apocalyptic literature. You don't understand it. You are imposing your literalistic hermeneutic on ancient Hebraic apocalyptic. When we come to the terminology of flesh and spirit, William, isn't that what happens as well in discussions of eschatology? Here in Romans chapter 8, boy, where to start? The Romans 8 is so rich. Let's just start with verse 5. Those who live according to the flesh, they set their minds on the things of the flesh. Those who live according to the Spirit, the things of the Spirit. For to be carnally minded is death, but to be spiritually minded is life and peace. Because the carnal mind is enmity against God, for it is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can be. And then, of course, he makes this astounding comment. Those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Well, it seems to me, William, we ought to just throw up our hands and say, it's helpless. I'm in the flesh. I can't please God. But is that the way Paul is using the word flesh? Now, remember, folks, before William answers here, remember this concept of flesh is directly tied to the adoption of the body. Okay? There's an interrelationship there that cannot be denied. Even futurists say, well, yeah, the future adoption of the body, that is the redemption of the flesh. But wait a minute. Paul says those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Help us out here, William, because boy, these terms flesh cannot please God. Oh man, this is serious stuff.
Oh yeah, that really would be tragic if in our human reality, in our human existence, we cannot please God, and that's what a lot of people are saying regarding these passages, or they are just referring it to a moral stance. They take a moral view of what the text is saying, but these are actually antithetical states of existence, covenantal existence. And so being in the realm of the flesh means being under the law, being in that realm where they are striving through their own means to obey the law, to do the law, which the scripture says, the man who lives in them shall do them, or the man who does them shall live in them. And no one could do that perfectly in order to obtain that. So they were under, in essence, their own ability, which was their inability to obtain the salvation that was in the law. And that's why it's categorized in this particular context as the realm of the flesh. And on the other hand, just as with the promise of Abraham, even with the two sons, because that's what Galatians is saying, one was born according to the flesh, the other was born according to the spirit, where they both were flesh and spirit in terms of a human being. But the difference was in the power of God and the work of the Spirit in bringing one into existence, and also maintaining that existence even after God told Abraham to go and kill him. It was the Spirit of God that prevented that from happening, which in essence to me shows that as Hebrews 11, I think 19 says, by faith Abraham received him as resurrected from the dead. So he's living by the power of God, and that's what living in the realm of the Spirit means. You're living according to the power of God, according to the power of the gospel, as opposed to the power of human strength trying to keep the law perfectly from that perspective. So that's the real difference. They're covenantal states between those who were under the law and those who surrendered themselves to the gospel through faith to follow Christ. And that's what he says in Romans 8 and 9. So then those who are in the flesh cannot please God. Well, that would mean none of us, not a single one, would be able to please God if we are looking at, the flesh on our physical bodies. But then he turns right around and speaks to the same men in the church and says, but you are not in the flesh. Well, how could that be? Was he talking to ghosts, disembodied spirits or something? No, he says you are not in the flesh, but why is that? If indeed the Spirit of God dwells in you. And if anyone does not have the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. So it was the Spirit that determined them as such. Just like the difference between the pneumatikos or natural man and the psychikos, natural man, and the pneumatikos man that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 15. So those are the contrasts. They're covenantal as opposed to physical or biological.
You know, and it's interesting to me, William, how as preterists, we are the ones being accused of being Gnostic. And yet it's Paul who said, if you're in the flesh, you can't please God. It is, pardon me, it is Paul that said, the flesh cannot please God. Boy, that sounds Gnostic to someone untrained in Pauline theology. And I really think this is significant. You know, Jim McGuigan, man that I've always highly, highly respected, had a debate with Max King years and years ago, written debate. And you could tell that Jim McGuigan got spooked. He was in trouble, and he knew he was in trouble, and he lashed out at King. Well, then much later in 1991, 90, somewhere along in there, he wrote another book entitled AD 70 Revisited. And in the book, he apologized to Max King for the way he treated him. And Jim McGuigan made the comment in his book, there's probably not another man in the churches of Christ who understands the doctrine of flesh and spirit as well as Max R. King. Well, I think that took an awful lot of courage and integrity on McGuigan's part. I appreciated that. I hope that it helped an awful lot of people. But folks, when we understand that Abraham was walking in the Spirit, Abraham was not walking by the law or by law. Abraham trusted God. And Abraham was even justified, as Paul raises the pertinent question in Romans chapter 4. Now, was Abraham justified after he was circumcised or before? Well, he was before. And to the Jew, that was just that's enough to make him run backwards. But no, that was his point. That being circumcised did not make Abraham a child of God. It did a Jew according to the flesh, but it did not make a person a Jew after the heart. And that's part of the reason why Paul in Romans 2, 28 and 29, a man is a Jew, not according to the flesh, but according to the heart. The man who keeps the law is a Jew without being circumcised. And so Paul understood very, very well that the person, and to use the terminology, the person and the work of Abraham was the foundation of the gospel of Christ in reality, because it was the pattern of justification by faith. It was the pattern for the reception of the inheritance of Abraham, which was not through the law or not through law keeping. And so Paul would say in Philippians chapter 3 that it was his desire to be found in him, not having the righteousness which is through the law, but the righteousness which is by faith in Jesus Christ. Just like Abraham's righteousness was through faith, not through law keeping. And that's just so incredibly, incredibly powerful. So back to Romans chapter 8. Here, Paul, and we're talking about the adoption, we're talking about sonship. We've only got 2 minutes left here. Paul goes ahead and says, therefore, brethren, we are debtors not to the flesh to live according to the flesh. Well, that means living according to a certain moral way, a life under a given covenant, or the Gentiles who were not under the law, they lived a life of flesh also. That was a life antithetical to faith. But he says, if we live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Now, William, I think this, even though we're not going to get any further than this, to me, this is one of those passages that people don't stop and think about. Okay, if you live according to the flesh, you will die. But if by the Spirit you put to death the deeds of the body, you will live. Now, wait a minute. Go back to verse 10. If Christ is in you, the body is dead because of sin, but the spirit is life because of righteousness. William, I always thought that we would die physically, the flesh would die because of sin, not because of Christ. But Paul
So that
says,
gives us a double death.
yeah, no
We
joke.
get a death from Adam, and then we get a death from Christ trying to deliver us from the death of Adam. It doesn't work.
I mean, I have appealed to this passage a million times, and people all of a sudden they start waffling, they start backpedaling, they start trying desperately to find some way out of their conundrum, because their whole approach to Romans chapter 8, when they talk about the body and the flesh and the mortal body, they say, well, yeah, that's the physical body, that's the physical body. Well, okay, Paul says if Christ is in you, the body is dead. So Christ dwelling in me is the cause of my physical death. Whoa. Yeah, talk about a double whammy. This is bad news. This is not good news. Okay, we're out of time. Folks, William will not be with us next week, as we've already pointed out. He'll be in Africa. We wish him Godspeed in his humanitarian work there. Wish you well, wish you safe travels, William. Look forward to you getting back and sharing with us about your journeys. And with that, I'll say good night to you. God bless to you. And folks, thank you for joining us here on Two Guys, a Bible, a voice you can trust. And I will say to all, good night. God bless.
Thank
All right, my friend.
Okay.
You be real safe.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. And you be safe when you all take your trip as well. Hope you enjoy yourselves.
Yeah, we're going to go to South Carolina for a little bit. If my brother Gary, he's in the hospital and been there since yesterday. I think I mentioned to you that the doctor told him about 2 weeks ago that he may have about a year to live.
Yeah.
And he got real bad and was in the hospital ER yesterday from 12 until they decided to admit him, and he's been in the hospital all day long today, and they think it's his heart. Well, he's got emphysema, he's got COPD, and they can't seem to get enough oxygen in him. And bottom line is his heart's going to give out. So
sorry to hear
that. He's known for years that he has signed his own death warrant with smoking to give himself emphysema. He's been aware of that. He refused to stop. I stopped preaching to him years ago about it because he told me I don't want to hear it. He said, I know what's coming. And he said, I'm not going to stop smoking.
So we had a lady like that in our church. She was a nurse, by the way.
Oh.
And she ended up with cancer as a result of her smoking. I don't know if she ever quit.
Well, he hasn't quit.
I don't think she did. And she's passed on now.
Yeah. Personally, I would rather go with a heart attack as to suffocate to death. And that's what COPD and emphysema does to you. You eventually cannot get any oxygen. And so they told him today that they believe that it's his heart that is just struggling so hard because of his lack of oxygenation, And so it would not surprise me at all if he doesn't pass in the next 2 weeks. It wouldn't surprise me.
So, does he try to smoke now?
You couldn't get him to stop smoking if you had to. Wow. I talked to him 2 weeks ago. When I called him, I said, well, what are you doing? And he had a really, really bad spell just a week or so before. He's got his oxygen tank with him at all times. He has to turn it off. I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I'm sitting out here on my patio smoking and enjoying the view, enjoying the night. I'm going, you idiot. Of course, they won't let him smoke in the hospital, so I guess that's something. But no, he refuses. I don't get it, William.
I don't either.
So
Don't either.
thank the good Lord, I'm not addicted to cigarettes or caffeine. I'm just not. But it's difficult to imagine being that addicted. But he openly admitted to me on one occasion. He said, "Don, look, I know I'm addicted." And he said, "I hate to admit that. I know that's a weakness." But he said, "I thoroughly enjoy smoking. And I know I'm addicted to the caffeine." And he said, "I don't want you preaching to me anymore because I'm not going to stop smoking." So at the time, I just told him, "Oh, okay." I said, "You'll never hear me preach to you about smoking again." I said, "If you're resigned to what it's doing to you." He said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "I'll die of emphysema or cancer, one of the two." And he said, "It's just the way it is." Wow. I mean, I know it sounds silly. I would rather die healthy.
No, me too.
Well, good night, William.
All right.
Give our love to Leora, and you guys have a great trip.
Okay. Thank you very
All
much.
right. Bye bye.
All right. Good night.